thank you all for being here. Accelerating adaptation through valuation of nature-based infrastructure. I'm Richard Florzone. I'm CEO of IISD, and I'm just really excited to be here today for reasons that, well, I'll make clear in a moment with some of my opening remarks. But, you know, I'm going to actually just start with introducing our panelists here. I'm so pleased that we're here working from my way out. Patricia Fuller, Canada's Ambassador for Climate Change. Thank you, Patricia, for being here. Our very own Anne Hamill, who's Senior Director of Resilience at IISD. So normally Anne asks me the tough questions as the boss, but today I get to ask her the tough questions, Anne. Thank you. Chizuru Aoki, or as everyone who knows the GEF, Chiz, everyone knows Chiz, the Lead Environmental Specialist for the GEF, which sounds like an awfully big job, Chiz, like the Lead Environmental Specialist. That sounds like almost everything that the GEF would do. And then finally, we have got Leonardo Garrido, lead economist with the New Climate Economy at WRI. Leo, it's great to have you with us. So listen, I want to just make some introductory remarks, and then we're going to open it up and get right into some questions. So first off on the topic, and welcome everyone for being here. I think it's fair to say that, you know, the interest in nature-based solutions or nature-based infrastructure is growing by the day. I don't think that's an exaggeration. We've certainly seen that at ISD. And that's because, you know, investing alongside nature, by investing alongside nature, we can deliver projects that are positive, well, to put it bluntly, for people and the planet. In other words, you can find projects that are good for climate mitigation, carbon storage, for adaptation. But if done right, they can also be positive for biodiversity, for people, and actually for economics, right? The economy. So done right, you can actually get a better ROI just measured by dollars. So there's a great opportunity there and a great increased interest that we're seeing. But of course, we don't have the scale of investment needed to really capture that opportunity. You know, and the need is great. So if you look, for example, broadly at the scale of investment needed to accomplish the SDGs, you know, that's estimated at over $4 trillion annually. And that's a major ask, especially with post-COVID budgets, you know, for governments that are strained. The other hurdle, not just the scale of the challenge, is that gray infrastructure, right? Traditional infrastructure is the default option, really, for investors, for infrastructure planners, and governments. And that's really a missed opportunity because what our research shows, and ISD, we've just done a recent report on this, is that nature-based infrastructure can provide a lot of those same services as gray infrastructure, but can actually be up to 50% cheaper to build. Now, that's partly due to capital cost. Again, if you're building with natural resources, you're building with things that are already there, like wetlands or sand dunes, right? So that investment is already there. We also know that NBI, or nature-based infrastructure, can provide up to 28%, or nearly 30% better value for money than gray infrastructure. And of course, when you look at the world's great infrastructure needs, those savings mean that that's more money that is available for other development priorities. So for example, our estimate, we think it's quite reasonable that we could replace in sort of the global infrastructure investment. We think there's about 10 or 11% that could be replaced through natural infrastructure. And if you did that, you'd free up nearly $250 billion US a year. So very significant. Again, the interest in NBI is because of its multiple benefits, but there's a big economic prize to be had as well. Now, so why isn't this happening? Why isn't this moving forward? Well, fortunately, we actually know some of the barriers to progress and how to overcome them. So the reasons that nature-based infrastructure solutions aren't being scaled basically come down to knowledge of its performance, its predictability, and its financial viability. They just haven't been well understood until now. And that actually is the context a little bit for this session, is we have just launched IISD together with the GEF, the MAVA Foundation, and the UN Industrial Development Organization. We're launching a new global resource center, the NBI Global Resource Centre, which will help to make this transition happen. So that center will showcase the potential of nature-based infrastructure. It will improve the track record for building with nature. It'll build the case studies, and it'll do the valuation to get the knowledge sharing so that we can start all to pursue this attractive asset class. So listen, I could tell you more about ISD's experience in this, but I think it'll be much more interesting just to jump into our panel. So that's a snapshot. So just to kind of jump into the questions, my first question for the panel, and boy, you don't even know who I'm going to ask this to, so maybe I'll just see who wants to run with it. What is the current state of play with nature-based infrastructure, including at COP26? To what extent are we already seeing NBI feature in adaptation plans, in NDCs? Who'd like to start by talking about the state of play? Patricia, you look like you're itching to pick up the microphone, so we're going to go to you first.
So this is on? Yes. So good afternoon. Great to be here with Richard and other colleagues that I've worked with so closely. I'm keen to take the mic on this one because I think we've come a long way in a short period of time. I'm thinking back to the last time we were together at a COP in Madrid where there was it was incipient, I would say, the buzz around nature-based solutions. It was really just beginning to be commonly talked about in the climate context. And of course, nature-based solutions as a way of sequestering carbon, I think that's been of course, the subject of carbon offsets and a whole lot of work for a long time, but the realization around the benefits in terms of adaptation and the advantages of green over gray infrastructure was something that I think was just starting to come more into the COP and climate conversations. And then following Madrid, we had the Global Commission on Adaptation, which had nature-based solutions as one of its 6 action track areas of work, focused really on the benefits of nature-based solutions for building resilience to the impacts of climate change. So the kinds of benefits that Richard is referring to in terms of, the classic examples of how wetlands are a more economically effective and a strategy which has so much other benefits to it for rainwater, stormwater management, as one example. Coastal ecosystems being another commonly used example of the benefits of nature-based infrastructure for protecting against the impacts of climate change. Storm surges, we've seen mangroves often used as an example, but also salt marshes, dune restorations as very effective approaches to protecting against the impact of climate change. So I'm looking at Chiz here because we did with GEF and with Mexico and a number of other partners a lot of work in the context of the Global Commission on Adaptation on nature-based solutions as a strategy for adaptation, and obviously infrastructure is a big part of that. So yes, I think we've come a long way in a short period of time in terms of raising awareness of this opportunity.
Thanks, Patricia. So you raise an interesting kind of insight that people have always, for a lot of years, have thought about investing in nature-based infrastructure for its mitigation efforts. But what you're saying is, maybe it's because of the increased focus now on adaptation and resilience why this has come more to the fore. And I see Chiz nodding. Chiz, do you want to get in on this, on the kind of the state of play and where we are in nature-based infrastructure? Because you're seeing this, you've obviously seen the interest of the GEF. You wanted to start this new center. So what's the context?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I think we're in day 6 or day 5 of negotiations, right? On the other side of this big, vast building. And I think in terms of nature-based solutions or nature-based infrastructure, I'm probably hearing it in 4 different contexts. The very first one is obviously the 100 billion question, the finance, right? And the second one and the third one, as Patricia clearly articulated, it's a question of utilization of nature-based solution for adaptation, nature-based solutions for also mitigation. And I'm also hearing within the context of loss and damage. So I would say those are some of the areas that we're starting to hear it. And for us, it's very interesting to really focus on nature-based infrastructure as well as nature-based solutions, because we do think, as you said earlier, there is for us, the question of how we can really promote the nature-based infrastructure as well as valuation to really let the countries and ourselves get closer to meeting the finance gap, both for mitigation and adaptation. And the kinds of work that the center will do, as well as the kinds of analytics that we're already hearing coming out of IISD, those are very, very important to us because they will let the countries know that there is potential to really do a lot more work that you need to do in terms of infrastructure development or infrastructure, I would say rehabilitation. And if you're able to really value nature in a way that will make economic and business case, that will help you really narrow the finance gap on the kinds of interventions you might be thinking about. So I think that's very important for mitigation and adaptation. And the last one is loss and damage. How do we minimize, avert, prevent loss and damage? And within that context, again, the role of nature-based solution is being talked about a lot. So we just have to wait and see how that's going to turn out. You know, how we're going to sort of operationalize Santiago framework is one of the things that's being talked about. We have, what, 1 more week to go? We'll see.
Thanks, Chiz. Yeah, I want to underline a point you made, which was about the valuation. You know, we've just seen, one of the exciting things about this COP is we're seeing many more private sector commitments, right? And we're not going to get that unless we can do the valuation. But it's not enough to just value the dollars. We have to have a holistic valuation of the social environmental benefits, and that really is at the heart of what we're trying to do at the center and what we're trying to do with the GEF. I'm going to come back to Anne in a moment, who's our specialist on adaptation, on how this is fitting into NAP plans. And let me also say to our tech support, I realized in my excitement, I rode right over the video we were supposed to have at the beginning. So what we're going to do, I'm going to just finish with our 2 speakers, then we'll do the video. It'll be more dynamic. We'll do the video and then come back. Is that okay? Do the video in 5 minutes? I'll give you the cue. 4 minutes? 5 minutes? Yeah, 5 minutes. Leo, this is all very casual at COP26, right? Leo, so state of play from WRI's perspective.
I'll take 1.5 of those.
Okay,
minutes.
yeah.
I would call it as coming of age. That's what I would put it. And there are 3 reasons for that. Urgency, knowledge, and data. Number 1, the awareness and understanding that we are on track to be above the target on carbon emission reduction, and that adaptation becomes quintessential on the next years and years to come is number 1. Number 2, the increased knowledge about the interrelationship between climate and the economy, that science tells us the basic information that is useful for us to understand what are the implications on society by metrics beyond those that we understand in economics, GDP, employment, income, but what happens through biodiversity, water resources, and so forth. And number 3, data, very important. The fact that we have made so much progress that people do not probably realize, for instance, through the system of environmental and economic accounts developed by the UN that enable us to have information that now can be put into place to do exactly what you say, Richard, to have the economics right, to provide the right value to those things that are really hard to value at the beginning, but now we are understanding. So with all those 3 things in hand, we are getting into the toolkit so we can do a proper evaluation of the natural base and hence to bring it into policy.
Well, thank you, Leo, and thank you for mentioning all those ways we have to think about the valuation. I know our valuation staff in our Geneva office are listening to the webcast, so I'm hoping they were taking notes during your great remarks. And you run our NAP Global Network, right? So we have over 100 developing countries who are focused on adaptation. We're going to have an event on Monday, right? I'm giving my commercial here with the U.S. At the U.S. Pavilion on that great initiative. When you look at adaptation overall, how are you seeing this conversation in countries about the interest in nature-based infrastructure? Is it kind of a sideshow? Is it increasing? What are your reflections from the past year?
I'd have to say that actually, I think this is actually a long-standing conversation and interest. I think we didn't necessarily have the term nature-based solutions, but I think there have always been a lot of really interesting, innovative, integrated solutions in the adaptation space. And so we were working on it with partners like IUCN, for example, almost 20 years ago, looking at how you could strengthen the role of ecosystem management and restoration in reducing the vulnerability of communities to the impacts of climate change. And I think, you know, terminology and naming counts. And I think the compelling sound of nature-based solutions, that solutions language, I think kind of propelled it to where we're seeing it today. Also, I think that we're seeing a lot of policy recognition for nature-based solutions. And so I know that IUCN and Oxford University did a review, and they saw that over 130 countries mentioned nature-based solutions in their NDCs. And the vast majority of them actually was about using nature-based solutions as a tool for adaptation. I think 104, as opposed to maybe 30 for mitigation. And that wouldn't have really necessarily been the case even 5 years ago, I don't think. So really seeing that adaptation is sort of front and center in the conversation around nature-based solutions. And from our perspective, we focus on national adaptation plans, and there are 30 that have officially been communicated to the UNFCCC, and all of them mention ecosystem services, nature-based solutions in national adaptation. And whether it's coming up with actions to reduce the vulnerability of ecosystems to the impacts of climate change, but more often than not, how ecosystems can be harnessed and the services they provide can also be used to reduce the vulnerability to the impacts. So a lot of policy recognition too.
That's great, Anne. Thanks so much. It's great to hear from the front lines of those 100 countries that you work with. And two really important points I want to draw out there. One is that this isn't new, as you point out, and that's good. That means we're drawing on decades of knowledge and experience of this asset class. But what is new, to kind of go back to Patricia's point, is this focus on resilience. And I do believe, and I've seen it with very senior cabinet minister level or heads of state, the concern about the climate change that we're seeing, particularly in the past year, has increased the attention on adaptation and resilience, and therefore investing in nature. And that's what's different, right? Is this, there's always been an interest in investing in nature for nature's sake, but now there's kind of this idea of we need to invest in nature to better protect people, right? And that's something that I'm really seeing. Are we able to, so that's a great intro actually. That was good that I altered the agenda, because now let's just jump to that quick video on our Center for Nature-Based, our NBI Resource Centre.
Both tackle climate change and support our economies. As governments around the world grapple with the climate crisis, it has become clear that building with nature, rather than exploiting it, can help solve many of our most pressing infrastructure challenges. Natural landscapes like forests, floodplains, and wetlands can be built up to meet our infrastructure needs, while also helping us preserve the health and diversity of our planet. What's more, they come with major economic and social benefits. So how do we convince investors, project developers, and government officials to back nature-based infrastructure, or NBI? The NBI Global Resource Centre is an initiative led by the International Institute for Sustainable Development and supported by the Global Environment Facility, the Marva Foundation, and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Over the next few years, the Centre will establish a business case for nature-based infrastructure by providing data, training, and customized valuations. Just like nature itself, we're all about working with complex systems. Using extensive socioeconomic, environmental, and financial modeling, anchored in an approach called systems dynamics, we demonstrate the value of natural infrastructures. By providing data-driven, customized valuations of nature-based infrastructure projects, we help shift mindsets across the world. We show that the capital and operating costs of natural alternatives can outperform traditional grey infrastructure. The NBI Global Resource Centre also works to build new partnerships and alliances to scale up green infrastructure projects worldwide. If you have a proposal for a nature-based infrastructure project, we want to hear from you. Together, we can build with nature for a better future. Join us and become part of the nature-based infrastructure revolution.
Very good. Well,
nature has the power.
Maybe you get some of the reasons why I'm excited about this. So look, let's cut right to the heart of the matter. The big challenge here is scaling. Now, we've obviously said in designing this center, and Shiz working with you in the GEF, we've said, as you heard in the video, data, training, valuations, those are the barriers that'll move things forward. But let's talk a little bit about that and about other challenges. You know, we all know that there's great examples of nature-based infrastructure and solutions, and we can show them, whether it's wetlands, mangroves. But the problem is, how do you do this at scale, given the scale of the challenge? Who wants to jump in here? What do you think? You know, how can we better scale nature-based infrastructure? What are the challenges beyond what we've outlined, what we're trying to tackle in the center? Anyone want to jump in? Patricia, you're going to go first. This is very orderly. We're going left to right. Very good. Thank you.
Well, I do just want to underline the valuation point a little bit. We've talked about it already, but I think in the conversations we had in the context of the Global Commission on Adaptation, the message was you really need it at the, you know, from the perspective, for example, of a municipality, which is usually where this really comes to matter. It's at the asset valuation kind of point where, you know, a municipality needs to understand or be able to measure the value of that wetland in terms of its equivalent cost for gray infrastructure. So, you know, for the town of the oft-used example of Gibson's, BC, where they put a number on that wetland because if they had to build gray infrastructure to do the same job in terms of stormwater absorption and rainwater absorption, it would be worth whatever it was. I think it was $2 million or something like that. So valuing it from that perspective so that when it comes to the discussions around, do you protect this area or do you expand the areas you're protecting, that they can really actually value it from the perspective of an asset for a municipality, for example. So I do think that's a very important area of work for your center, and would encourage it to be done from that perspective. But I think then the second thing is the innovations around how do you enable private sector investment in those assets, and that's not easy from an adaptation perspective to create structures that enable investment, private sector investment. That, you know, there has to be a return on that asset. But I think the insurance industry is you know, has a huge interest in doing this and in making this work. So. Again, coming out of the work we did in the GCA, we have the Insurance Bureau of Canada piloting some projects around insurance products for nature-based solutions for adaptation that can be mechanisms of bringing private sector investment into this space. So I think that's where we're trying to go.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Fuller. Just to pick up on a couple of those things. Yeah, you know, those of us who love nature in its own right and value in its own right can be nervous about putting a dollar value on it. But you're right, municipalities have stretched budgets, right? So you make a good point. They've got to make those trade-offs, and they've got accountability back to taxpayers, ratepayers. And so it's great to hear that support for valuation, because it's the heart of the center. Chiz, I'm going to put you on the hot seat on this private sector point. You know, we've thought a lot about this, and you and I have talked a little bit about it. When I read the GEF 8 replenishment plan, there talks about there's a real multiple of private sector investment you're looking for. Talk to us a little bit about these challenges and how you think we can close this gap. Because, you know, the last decade, a lot of the targets on private sector investment, we just haven't met them, right? So advice, barriers, how do we get the private sector investment into nature-based infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I would have to say, in terms of trying to engage with the private sector in climate solutions, if you think it was hard for mitigation, try adaptation. It has been extremely challenging, and particularly within the context of the countries that we tend to work on, especially LDCs. You might not have the big multinationals or a lot of more technically, systemically integrated through the value chain companies that you might see in the mitigation sector, right? And also quite a number of micro, small, medium-scale enterprises that might have a lot of solutions to enable some of the adaptation actions to be accelerated. But they're scattered all over the world. So, you know, in terms of really systematically trying to engage with the private sector as we call it, that in itself has been a big challenge for us, right? So one of the things that we have been trying to do at the GEF is obviously trying to really find these types of private sector partners even in the LDC as well as other more challenging contexts. And how can we actually work with them and build partnerships through at the country level or through the value chain or the systemic ways, and how you engage with them to really tackle this kind of more fundamental systemic issues together with us. So that's one of the ways that we have been dealing with it. Within the context of LDCs, and I would say CIS, a lot of incubator support, really trying to support them to see their role as well as their niche in identifying adaptation solutions that could be scaled up, as well as, I would say, more widely distributed and utilized to reach that critical mass of solutions, as well as the purveyors of that kind of services within the context of the specific country or specific sector. So a lot of, I would say, I wouldn't say it's trial and error, but there is still a lot of work to be done, in particularly from the perspective of really having adaptation solutions out there. And one more thing I would put is that there are also financial instruments as well as support the funds like the GEF can provide, and those might include a lot of non-grant type initiatives, particularly if the solutions are out there as well as the partners are more robust. But we are also providing quite a bit of technical assistance to work with these kinds of private sector partners. So.
Thank you, Chiz. And that's sobering, as you say, if it's tough for mitigation, how tough it is for adaptation. But we all like to tackle tough problems, right? So that's okay. Leo, is there any comment you want to make about the barriers, either about private sector participation and the barriers? Yeah.
Sure. Once I learned that when you are in a panel and they ask you a question, you have to make at least 2 points, no more than 3. So I'm going to make another 3, like in the previous question. 2 refer to the pre-investment stage of this problem, and 1 to the investment side. On the pre-stage side, there is one clear one, is that we need to make sure that the analytical value that we get from embarking in these exercises, it's something that is there to face off the political economy ones. Because as we know, the main obstacle to advance project is the status quo investment, great infrastructure. How can we make the case based on science, based on numbers, for this particular type of infrastructure that can deliver better outcomes for society? So that's number 1, the analytics. Number 2, in order for this to be effective and to be a scale-up, we need to make sure that we are doing this hand in hand with partners, with countries, so that building the capacity, bringing this framework that you have wonderfully described here, the extent to which is done, together with local partners. And I have here with me colleagues from Ethiopia, from the Environment, Forestry, and Climate Change Commission, that we are about to embark in one such exercise in NBI. It's something that will guarantee take on some buy-in, because there will be the internal knowledge that is required to advance it, keeping in mind that this sort of framework is one that requires complex and multiple data that can be only get with participation of the locals. And then on the investment stage of the process, we need also to make sure that once we have all this put in place, to demonstrate with economics that the valuation, that the value that we get out of this activity it's much higher than the one that we get through economic projects. So when we get to that point to convince investors why it makes sense to put the money here and not in the other, it's what sort of nudge action to take place.
Yeah, thanks for that, Leo. You know, you reminded me of something. I mean, I think your point about working with partners, that's true for any big infrastructure project, right? If you don't have local buy-in, you're just going to fail in participation. But it's reminding me that on these projects, I think it's, you know, when we talk about valuation, we talked about the importance of economics, but it's also the importance of those social and environmental factors, right? Because if you're looking at, if you're engaging the whole community, you've got to be able to assess and understand all of that qualitatively and quantitatively. So you need holistic valuation. Chiz, I saw your hand up, or Anne, I don't know if did you want to get back at, Anne, did you want to get in on this one, on the barriers and private sector? I mean, most of the work you do through NAP is publicly funded in the planning side of things. Do you want to talk about barriers from that side or the private sector participation side?
I think maybe back to the point of, you know, scaling up. And yeah, I will talk from a policy perspective. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of having a policy signal. And having a national adaptation strategy that calls out the importance of nature-based solutions. Otherwise, I think beforehand, especially I would say in the adaptation space, a common sort of observation and frustration we've been hearing over the years is that it's just highly projectized. And so that's the role of these national policies and strategies, right? And so we're seeing in countries where they've called out that nature-based solutions is going to be an important part of this country's strategy for dealing with the impacts of climate change. There's been an acceleration of the uptake, and there's also easier communication happening between sectors or across sectors about what these solutions look like. And so I think, you know, there's something to be said for these strong policy signals, and then also policy alignment. You know, aligning, you know, national adaptation plans or NDCs with those that are related to the CBD, so the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans. They need to be sort of speaking to each other and working because they can be mutually reinforcing policies that are really trying to achieve the same thing. And so if you strengthen that sort of alignment as well, I think you're going to also see greater action at scale.
Thanks, Anne. You know, so on your point on policy signals and alignment, it actually brings me to the next question I want to turn to the panel on. And the question was, as it was in your notes, about financing NBI, right? So how do we improve or develop the financing instruments for NBI? I'm going to put out a hypothesis for you that I want you to challenge or disagree with me. My sense is we don't actually need new instruments. We've got blended finance, we've got ways of going about this. But what we're missing, and that's what we're trying to do with the center, I think, is to create the market to structure the projects. Let me clarify what I mean. As you've just heard from Mark Carney and others, there's lots of private money that wants to move into the climate space. There's also a lot of people who want to do things that are positive for nature. The challenge is putting together those difficult projects, those projects that have the multiple co-benefits, that have some private revenue stream. It can be done. There are case studies out there. It's not easy. But we need to identify the case studies, and that's what we're going to try to do through the center. So my point is, I don't think you need necessarily new instruments. You can use guarantees, first loss, all that kind of stuff, blended finance. But I don't know. Maybe Chiz, I could start with you because this is something you'd think about. So what do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Do we need new tools? Do we need new funds?
I think you're right. And I think one of the issues that we at the GEF are very hopeful to achieve through this project isn't necessarily just to work on a project by project valuation. It is for us to work with institutions that might have these kinds of ideas as well as projects. And once you work through them on the valuation and help them make a more cogent business case, there is a built-in replicability within these institutions that are in the position to really catalyze a lot more financing as well as support for these types of initiatives. And here I'm talking about some of the GEF agencies that are already working in this kind of nature-based solutions. But to be honest, a lot of times, if given the option between going with great infrastructure for which there is very clear-cut business case, valuation, whatever to be made, versus something like nature-based solutions where they might not be a, I would say, widely appreciated, widely applicable methodological framework or valuation to be actually requesting resources or going for loans or whatever. And this is where I think there is a great potential for a program or project like this to really build that sort of cadre of institutions that are in a position to mobilize additional resources for nature-based infrastructure. And those are the ones I really am excited about being able to sort of entice to get into this program through the Global Center.
Oh,
so.
Chiz, I'm so excited by your comments. I've got to give a commercial. So as Chiz said, the point here isn't just to do a few case studies and publish them or whatever. We're trying to build a network of institutions. So the commercial I'm going to give to you, and I'll come to you at the end, is we're looking for projects, and we're not going to charge you. So what we're looking for is basically 40 best case studies of nature-based infrastructure where we can do this holistic assessment. Right, and we can work together to kind of build this ecosystem of knowledge that others can kind of leverage to capture the benefits of this asset class. So I'm going to come back to that at the end, but that's the invitation. We want to work with you, right? We've created this center through the generous funding and support of the GEF and the MAVA Foundation, UNIDO. We can do this, but it's about building this ecosystem and working with you. So that was my commercial, but I'll come back to it again at the end. Thank you, Chiz, for doing my job for me. Financing NBI, well, again, this idea, do we need new vehicles? Do we need new, I see Patricia's lifting her microphone. Ambassador Fuller?
So maybe I'll take you on that point, Richard, because I think when we come back to the point of, that there is that economic benefit to restoring and protecting natural assets, it creates certainly a benefit for those who have reduced costs for destruction that didn't happen. So I mean, let's take the example that's very commonly used of the Mesoamerican reef. So protecting that coral reef means that the hotels on the Yucatan Peninsula have less storm-related damage than they would have otherwise. So what we haven't had is a vehicle that makes it possible for those who have an economic interest in those reefs to actually invest in them in a way that can bring that to scale. So I do think that there's an instrument case, and it generally is in the insurance area. However, I would readily agree that there's a simpler point here that you do need to have, I would say, dedicated funding vehicles from the public side as well, recognizing the value and the public good of these assets. So I guess, 2 points on that. One is for our new investment in climate finance for developing countries from Canada, the $5.3 billion that we announced this past year, we will have a dedicated part of that for nature-based solutions as an area of focus, because we know that it's still being an incipient area. If we want to get projects in place, we do have to set a target, and we have to find those projects and have those there be an incentive for those projects to come forward. And similarly, second point, in Canada, we've had in place for a long time infrastructure funding for adaptation, where nature-based solutions have been eligible for the funding, but they have to compete against all the other projects, the gray ones. So now, in the recent federal budget, we have a dedicated fund for nature-based infrastructure, the $200 million fund that we established in this last year's budget, for both large-scale and small-scale projects. And so that, again, that ensures that this area is scaled up.
Thanks, Ambassador Fuller. No, I think those are great points. And let me summarize and see if I can fill out with what I was saying is, I think my point that we don't need new instruments, I think that structured finance has a full toolbox that we can draw from. The point that you're making is maybe we don't need a new instrument, but we're still very short on funding. And that is true for climate finance overall. We know about the $100 billion target, the shortfall. So you'll get violent agreement from me that we need more funding. And maybe it's around the word vehicle, because we still need more types of funds. We need our institutions. What we need to do is to reach into that structured finance toolkit, marry it up, get the added dollars and turn it into new funds and new projects. And that's basically what we're trying to do with this center. Leo or Anne, do you want to jump in on this financing topic? Try to clarify
Sure.
my very clumsy summary of it?
It's not. It's quite clear. And for me, the answer for this one is it's simple. Yes, we do need, and we do need. We are closing funding, of course. And on instruments, yes, to the extent that they will price into market the things that are not priced into the traditional instruments that are out there. And Patricia referred to one of them, this value that you get from the mangroves, not only from a touristic point of view, but the protection that they give to people, does not price anywhere in any financing instrument. Just think about what happened in Indonesia 15 years ago with the Aceh tsunami, where the communities that were saved in that community were those precisely behind the mangrove reef that was not affected by degradation, by the depletion of the resources. The value of that is nowhere into many of those instruments. To the extent to which those new instruments bring that into their prices, then I'll support that sort of more diverse portfolio, plus the scaling up, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Anne, is there any comment on the finance topic?
Maybe just a tiny one. I think oftentimes I think the conversation around valuation is about making the case for nature-based infrastructure and comparing it against traditional or gray infrastructure, and that's absolutely critical. But it's also, I think we need to get better at tracking progress and the continued value of these types of interventions throughout its lifetime. And I think that's where we're bumping up. I know in the adaptation field overall, measuring progress of adaptation investments is a challenge. And this is definitely going to be a challenge also for nature-based infrastructure. So we just need to be ready for that challenge, I think, coming up with the right sort of metrics and frameworks to be able to track progress and delivery throughout the lifetime of that investment.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, great points. Listen, I'm going to abuse my privilege as chair to just say that I think we're right that we have to think about, as Leo said, valuation of ecosystem services. But I do think that there is still maybe some lower hanging fruit, if you will, that some of the projects we've seen, even with traditional valuation, it's about bundling projects. So, for example, in forestry projects, sometimes we see where if you blend a preservation project with maybe a timber project, you can blend that with the public and private finance to make it go. So there are still opportunities, I think, to blend projects and structure projects that can work. In the last few minutes, let me turn to the final question, which is about the roles of various participants: governments, cities, business, development banks, the international community, infrastructure investors. I don't know, I want to turn to you, Ambassador Fuller, because you've got the most bird's eye view as an ambassador for climate change. What do you see as you've watched this topic and you're involved with the GCA, the Global Commission on Adaptation? What do you think some of the roles are, or where some of the gaps? Who needs to be more aware of this and be more involved to drive forward on nature-based infrastructure?
So I think the challenge is that nature-based solutions and nature-based infrastructure are inherently local. And so you need those partnerships built up really at the local level. But that's a good thing, because that's where you can really have governments, private sector, philanthropy come together around a local problem and put together a local solution that can be nature-based infrastructure. And so I think the opportunity here is for getting behind that local leadership and for whether it's multilateral development banks or national governments to ensure that the funding that we're putting into place for nature-based infrastructure is accessible to local level community leadership and certainly in cities and communities, but also in areas that may be more remote, or I must underline the important leadership of indigenous communities in this space, where, for example, in Canada, we have the Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs, which is a program that the federal government is investing in with indigenous communities, where they're taking the leadership to protect and conserve areas that have, of course, all of the benefits that nature-based solutions always have, but including those climate benefits. So I think it's getting behind that local leadership in many
Thank you, Ambassador. And yeah, the local leadership, I think, for any infrastructure project, as we said earlier, is absolutely fundamental. I'm glad you mentioned indigenous participation, because it's always struck me what's kind of remarkable about nature-based solutions and nature-based infrastructure is it's intrinsically an idea that is very consistent with a lot of traditional indigenous knowledge, and it seems like we're only catching up now to realize the value of nature. So thanks for raising that. A few more minutes just as we wrap up, maybe 30 seconds each on our other panelists. Any comment on the role of various stakeholders, opportunities or gaps with government, private investors, multilateral development banks? I see Leo reaching for his microphone.
30 seconds it is. So yes, and I'm very glad that Patricia mentioned the role of indigenous communities, because I had a feeling that in any event here at COP, we don't mention just transitions, then we didn't close the circle. And one of the characteristics of the NBIs is that they do target an issue that is at the heart of the climate transition, which is bringing the communities and protecting the ones that stand to lose the most with climate change and and the extent to which NBIs do protect those assets in which people's, poor people, vulnerable people depend on, and integrate them into the policy process is essential. So communities, governments, of course, because they need to drive the process, and private sector because we need to have, at the end of the day, that sort of muscle in order to integrate into the advances projects.
Thanks, Leo. Chiz?
30 seconds. I would say two practical entry points from what we said. One is cities, right? Simply because we have been having a sustainable cities impact program as well as integrated program that we're trying to continue into the next phase of the GEF, where we're working with quite a number of cities in developing countries to really introduce integrated solutions, including nature-based solutions. So from that perspective, and plus a lot of infrastructure development for urban development in developing countries, will actually require a lot of infrastructure resources coming in from now. I mean, more than 90% still needs to be done. So we do think that's a nice window of opportunity for us to look into. The other one is, I would say, development banks, because we work quite closely with them. When you look at the portfolio projects that are submitted to us, quite a number of infrastructure-related projects do come from development banks. So if there is a way to work with them, really going back to my point from our earlier question, how can we actually work with them to start building the business case and really building that critical mass of knowledge as well as awareness and acceptance, if you will, of the valuation at the institutional level? I think that's one of the a good ways for us to make a great advance and transformation in really promoting nature-based infrastructure. So those, I would say, those two are the ones for us.
Chiz, look, that's great, and I'm taking up some of my own 30 seconds, but it's both global and local, right? Yeah. So on the global level, everyone recognizes the multilateral development banks that we have to think, and there's a big discussion now about how they should be engaging in climate finance. And I think, when I think about the GEF aid and I think about this topic, clearly IFC, right, the private sector arm of the World Bank, there's a big opportunity here. And then local, it's interesting that you've all come onto most municipalities and indigenous knowledge, because of course climate change, that's where it's felt, where people live on the ground. It's also true for infrastructure that, at least for public funds, it's usually in municipalities, right? So that's a focus. And do you want to get in on the stakeholder and the role of various players as the final words?
Sure, just want to reiterate absolutely that agreeing on strong safeguards for nature-based solutions is critical, I think, to seeing this take off at scale and having the legitimacy that we need it to have. I think we're already starting to hear some sorts of doubts and some pushback against sort of this broad embrace of this comment, so I think having strong safeguards in place will be critical. Also, I think working with, whether it's local communities, local governments, and also research organizations. When you look at nature-based solutions right now, it's typically around what we have, like forests, freshwater, and coastal ecosystems. But there are a lot of other ecosystems that are critical to reducing the vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. So here we're thinking about drylands and grasslands. We see some on wetlands, but I think these are sort of underrepresented right now in the nature-based solution space, and I think there's a lot of potential, and working with the right communities to really unlock our knowledge around those ecosystems will be critical too.
Yeah, great points, Anne. Standards and safeguards, that shows up in the literature all the time. Look, great points. Listen, so we're gonna jump to a video. As I said to folks, over the night, and this is the commercial break, if you will, but it's also for you. Over the next 4 years, we'll be assessing over 40 nature-based infrastructure projects and comparing their performance to built infrastructure. So we're welcoming you to submit projects for our consideration. So if you have an NBI or a hybrid project, we want to hear from you. Again, we do a customized assessment at no cost. That's the plan. So what we have, just to bring this to life, and maybe we should have started with it, I don't know, but we're going to include, we've got some video testimonials now that show a diversity of stakeholders that we've been working with on valuations of NBI, including a stormwater project in the city of Johannesburg, and some work dredging industry in Netherlands, some infrastructure developers in Sri Lanka and South Africa. So I think we have a quick video, if we're able to roll that now, and then we'll wrap up.
Positive experience with IISD in assisting the city to deal with one of the main challenges related to nature-based infrastructure. Our work with IASD has helped us to understand that nature-based infrastructure are cost-effective solutions for infrastructure services, especially for services like stormwater runoff across the city. Also of particular importance in the context of Johannesburg is moving beyond typical financial cost-benefit analysis and also including benefits across the social and environmental spheres to make it clear that nature-based infrastructure is even more worthwhile to invest in. And all of the best in implementing these innovative solutions that will change our cities and the way the world is responding to climate change.
It was also important to demonstrate how much money will be lost if we don't act to preserve the wetlands in the current or better conditions. The SAVI assessment was a useful support tool also for the local farming companies that are investing in circular economy, and also for the local municipalities that are undertaking actions and policies to create a new governance model for these areas.
Currently, we are dealing with the protection of the Vjosa River, which has turned out to be the last free-flowing river in Europe. Working with SAVI has been a great experience for us in both directions, working with a team, which is very motivated, and also with a tool, which is an innovative tool. We have worked with SAVI for the assessment of the different scenarios of development for the Vjosa region, taking into account the two large dams that are planned to be built in the Vjosa. And I admitted that SAVI is actually the most comprehensive tool that brings all the pieces together in order to prepare the best analysis for different scenarios of the sustainable development.
Natural capital approaches, such as the Sustainable Asset Valuation (SAVI) method, can help development finance institutions to make better informed decisions on infrastructure investments by showing clearly the environmental and social costs, externalities, and impacts of infrastructure projects, and how these factors could affect an asset's viability and performance over time. The SAVI analysis of the AFDB-funded Kakono hydropower project in northwestern Tanzania revealed that it is the most climate and nature-resilient energy generation asset among various assessed alternatives. Such information is invaluable to the AFDB and other MDBs to design and finance infrastructure projects that are green, resilient, and sustainable. Thank you.
We collaborated with the City of Tshwane Metropolitan Municipality on the SAVI assessment for nature-based infrastructure. When we were first approached to collaborate with the city on the study, we were very interested because ingrained in the DNA of our development is the appreciation of the value of natural assets within mixed-use development in densifying cities. And having the asset of a very functional river running through our property, we're even more sensitive to the value of this asset and bringing it to optimal use. And we are thankful for the opportunity of this collaboration because I think we learnt even more than the study's numbers have produced. Thank you very much.
The team also went a little further. They superimposed these critical projections of how the lake will react to strategies of rejuvenation and varying degrees of intervention. And then what they did was they presented economic evaluations and the impacts thereof on the natural resource. And this gave a very strong incentive to developers and also policymakers to invest in the system, and especially into this multimodal approach into revitalizing this particular basin of the Beira Lake.
Constructing new marine infrastructure or maintaining ports and waterways has both a positive and sometimes a negative effect on the environment. That's why sustainability throughout the dredging industry is key, and finding nature-based solutions is crucial. To become truly sustainable, however, all impacts should be considered in project evaluations. The influence on biodiversity or recreational opportunities, for instance, are hardly taken into account in project evaluations. IADC believes in promoting inclusion of all externalities. The result of the SAVI assessment of the Hondsbossen and Pettermer Sea defense has allowed IADC to showcase the benefits of nature-based solutions and the additional value that can be created.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Fuller, Anne, Chiz, Leo. Thank you for a great conversation. We really went into deep. I hope folks didn't mind. I think we can all agree, and we've seen, the positive potential of this asset class, right? That it really can, done right, be positive for climate, for biodiversity, for people, and even for economics. It seems too good to be true, but it is possible, and that's what this NBI Centre means to build on. So, but we've all got to work together to achieve it. So we look forward to working with you. If any of you are interested, I'll be happy to chat with you afterwards, or any of my colleagues. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation. Thank you.